Hi there, Gateway Life Groups. I hope you're doing well, and I hope that you are enjoying, or maybe that's not quite the right word, at least appreciating our series in 1 Corinthians at the moment. And I'm going to give you some questions around 1 Corinthians 5. So I'm going to summarize the sermon, give you a chance to read it, and as we often do, give you a few questions that you can discuss and pray into. So the passage was 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and we've noticed, haven't we, that the Corinthian church have lots of problems, and one of their main issues, the thing that seems to tie all of this together, or most of it, is what we might call cultural assimilation. That means that the problems from their culture are being allowed to invade the church. And we've seen that in their leadership, in the way they think about wisdom, and we've seen the disunity that is caused in their church. Well, I would say the problem in today's passage is that they've forgotten who they are. They've forgotten that the church is called to be God's holy temple. And so that's what we looked at. And I talked about the situation that's happening here in the passage that you'll read about in a minute. So a man is having sex with his father's wife, probably his stepmom. This is a form of incest that was repulsive not just to the Christians but to people, the pagans and those around them. And Paul says, you've warned this guy about this, you've asked him to stop, you now need to put him out of the church. He can't be allowed, if he is claiming to be a Christian and part of your community, he can't be allowed to carry on doing this. You need to take action. And I was saying that Paul, a little bit like a surgeon, might be, with cancer, might be cutting something out. There's a surgery that's required here. Paul actually uses the idea of yeast. Just like in the Passover, they would take out the yeast out of their bread to remember what God had done for them. Paul is saying, you are the unleavened people. We looked very briefly at Leviticus 18, which really helps us understand the idea of sexual immorality. If you want to in your groups, you could glance back there and see how the first few commands in Leviticus 18, this man explicitly disobeys. And that's this idea of sexual immorality that's been discussed in the church, that phrase that Paul uses, the Greek word porneia, that it really is anything outside of sex between a husband and wife. And we see this in Leviticus 18 and 20. And that's something that the New Testament retains. It's an idea that Jesus retains from the Old Testament. Well, we talked then about the holiness of the church being God's temple. And we talked about how we don't really like Paul's response here because we much prefer the idea of tolerance, the idea of we don't really like challenging people. And this is uncomfortable, isn't it? It's an uncomfortable passage. But how in Paul's mind, because as he said in chapter 3, verse 16, the church is God's holy temple, this was a kind of desecration of God's temple, an intentional, persistent sinning in a way that was desecrating the temple. And we talked about the pitfalls that we can have when we begin to think about personal holiness and holiness of the church. We could fall into legalism, making all sorts of rules about how people must be holy, and the church can become a very joyless place. It's the kind of idea we're thinking of is what the Pharisees were like in the Gospels. We certainly don't want to fall into that. But on the other side is this that we sometimes call antinomianism. That's a kind of technical term for God doesn't mind what I do. It doesn't matter how I live. It doesn't matter what the church is like. And that's the other pitfall that we can fall into. And somehow, rather than those, we need to walk through knowing that it does matter, but that Jesus, our Passover lamb, has died for us. And we look particularly in verses 7 to 9 how Paul, in his metaphor of the yeast, reminds them that Jesus, just as the Israelites put the blood of the lamb on the doors to save them during the Passover, that Jesus is our Passover lamb. And so he has died for our sin, and he has made us holy. And so we're to remember the Passover, we're to remember that Jesus has died for us, and we are now holy people. We will mess up from time to time. So we then remember that we can be forgiven, that Jesus forgives us. No matter what you've done, no matter what others have done to you, you can know that holiness of God, and you can know that forgiveness. So we need to live with the fact that Jesus saves us from our sin in our minds. We need to remember who we are. We need to remember as the church is God's holy temple. Now, I've got 3 questions for you. The first one, in fact, why don't you read this? Why don't you pause and read 1 Corinthians chapter 5 together first? So why don't you pause and do that now, maybe going round in a circle. So if you've now read 1 Corinthians chapter 5, first question. So I talked about how earlier in the letter, chapter 3, verse 16, Paul has said that the church is God's holy temple. This is a key thing that we need to keep in our minds. If that is true, and Paul is concerned about the holiness of the church, how does this idea affect you and your own walk with God and our church community? How does this idea of being God's holy temple affect your walk with God and how you think about our church community? So you might want to discuss that in a large group, or you might want to get into smaller groups. Question number 2, in verse 11, there are a number of sins that Paul mentions. So he's not just talking about sexual immorality, but he goes on to list other sins that he is concerned about. In that list there, are there other sins that we sometimes just allow to happen in our own lives or in the church community? Are there other sins that we perhaps turn a blind eye to, that we don't repent of, that we don't take very seriously in that list? Go through that list, have a little think about your own, firstly yourself, your own heart, your own behaviour, but also for us as a church community. And the final thing is an opportunity to pray. So you're probably going to want to get into smaller groups if there's more than a few of you meeting together. And the question really is, what do you need to pray into? I'll give you a few examples, but I think it'd be great for you to take the opportunity to pray. You may need to pray and repent yourself of something that you've been convicted of. It may be something like what's mentioned in the passage in terms of it being sexual sin, but it may be other sins that you just become aware of and you think, I just need to repent. And repent knowing the forgiveness and grace of God. Or perhaps you need to be praying for someone else who you know is struggling in some of these areas. Or perhaps you want to pray for our church community, that we will have a greater sense of the holiness and grace of God. Those 2 things, the holiness and grace of God in our church community in Gateway. So take an opportunity to pray together and to pray for one another. I hope this blesses you and helps you, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.